In 2026, a stretch of sea just 21 miles wide closed. Within days, the price of oil broke records, the global economy lurched, and 3 ordinary sailors who had no part in any war never made it home. That sea is the Strait of Hormuz. And through that thread of water moves roughly 1/5 of all the oil the human race burns. Every single day, around 13 million barrels of crude oil pass through Hormuz. Tankers the length of skyscrapers line up nose to tail, carrying the fuel that runs factories in China, power plants in Japan, cars in India, and trucks across Europe. There is no other way out of the Gulf. The pipelines that try to bypass it can carry only a fraction. For the oil of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, this single channel is the only door to the open ocean, which makes 21 miles of water one of the most important places on Earth, and one of the most fragile. For decades, people warned about what would happen if someone ever closed it. In 2026, they stopped guessing. This is the story of the most dangerous 21 miles on the planet, how it shut, what it did to the price of everything, and the 3 men who never came home. You're watching Curiosity Threshold. Join me as we explore how one tiny strait could bring the global economy to its knees, and why the world can't look away. The Persian Gulf is almost a closed bathtub. It is ringed by some of the largest oil producers on the planet: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, sitting together on an enormous share of the world's proven oil reserves. And it has only one natural exit to the open sea. That exit is the Strait of Hormuz. On the northern shore stands Iran. On the southern shore, Oman and the United Arab Emirates. Between them, the navigable channel pinches down to a width you could photograph from a single drone. Every supertanker leaving the Gulf has to thread that needle, often passing within a few miles of the Iranian coast. Energy analysts have a name for places like this. They call them choke points. The Suez Canal is one. The Strait of Malacca is another. But Hormuz is in a class of its own, because so much of the world's energy has no alternative route. Roughly 13 million barrels of crude leave through it every single day, close to 20% of everything the world consumes, along with a large share of the planet's liquefied natural gas. And the customers are the engines of the global economy. China is the largest buyer. India, Japan, and South Korea follow close behind. So when oil from this one narrow channel stops flowing, the shock does not stay in the Gulf. It travels straight to the price of almost everything, almost everywhere. And in 2026, the world found out exactly what that looks like. For decades, a closure of the strait was a worst-case scenario on a planner's whiteboard. In 2026, it stopped being theoretical. In late February, the United States and Israel launched airstrikes on military targets inside Iran. Iran responded by doing the one thing the world had always feared. It closed the Strait of Hormuz to foreign shipping. The single door to the Gulf swung shut. The effect was almost instant. Within days, the price of Brent crude, the world's benchmark oil, leapt from the 70s to around $118 a barrel. It was the largest one-month jump in the entire history of the oil market. Roughly a fifth of global supply had been switched off at the source, and there was no quick way to replace it. Then the crisis escalated. In April, the United States threw a naval blockade around Iran's ports, trying to choke off Iran's own oil exports in return. Warships moved into position. For weeks, Two of the most powerful militaries on Earth faced each other across a channel just 21 miles, 34 kilometers wide, while the tankers that feed the global economy waited at anchor or simply turned around. The International Energy Agency would later call it the largest supply disruption in the history of the oil market. Not a hurricane, not an embargo from the 1970s. This, a modern war fought over the narrowest and most important sea lane in the world. And for months, nobody could say with any confidence how or when it would end. When the price of oil moves, almost nothing in the modern world stays still. Oil is not just fuel for cars. It is the raw material behind plastics, fertilizers, asphalt, and the diesel that moves nearly every truck, train, and cargo ship on the planet. So when crude jumped past $100 a barrel, that cost rippled outward into the price of food, of transport, of manufacturing, everywhere at once. Economists at the Dallas Federal Reserve estimated that cutting a fifth of the world's oil supply could knock nearly 3 percentage points off global economic growth in a single quarter. Some analysts warned that if the crisis dragged on, oil could climb toward $140 a barrel. Countries that pump their own oil, like the United States, were partly shielded. The pain fell hardest on the nations that import most of what they burn. Europe faced another energy shock just a few years after the last one. Japan and South Korea, almost entirely dependent on imported fuel, scrambled to lock in supply. And across Asia, central banks watched inflation, the steady rise in everyday prices, start to climb again just as they had finally been bringing it down. This is the hidden power of a choke point. A single channel, 21 miles, about 34 kilometers wide, does not just move oil. It quietly sets the cost of living for billions of people who will never see it. When it closed, families thousands of miles away paid more for groceries, for fuel, for rent, and most of them never knew exactly why. Few countries felt the squeeze quite like India. India is the world's third largest consumer of oil, and it imports nearly 90% of the crude it uses. Around half of that oil normally arrives through the Strait of Hormuz. So when the strait closed, the cost of India's oil nearly doubled in a single month, from about $69 a barrel in February to $126 in March, touching a peak near 157. For a country where the price of fuel touches the cost of nearly everything else, it was a body blow. India scrambled. Within weeks, it was buying crude from around 40 different countries and rerouting most of its imports away from Hormuz, leaning harder on supply from Russia, West Africa, and the Americas. By the middle of March, roughly 70% of India's crude was arriving from outside the strait. It was a remarkable piece of crisis logistics, but it could not undo the human cost. In June, a United States strike hit a commercial tanker, the Setabello, in the Gulf of Oman. On board were 24 Indian merchant sailors, civilians, not soldiers. 21 of them were rescued. 3 were not: Aditya Sharma, Shivanand Chaurasia, and Patnala Suresh. The United States said the tanker had been breaking its blockade by carrying Iranian oil. India condemned the strike, summoned an American diplomat, and demanded that attacks on commercial shipping stop. 3 working men, far from any front line, had become part of the price of a war they had no hand in starting. For a few days, it looked like it was over. In the middle of June 2026, the United States and Iran signed a deal to halt the fighting, lift the blockades, and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Tankers that had waited at anchor for weeks began to move again, and then it came apart. Israel and Hezbollah had never signed that agreement, and the strikes in southern Lebanon did not stop. Within days, Iran declared the deal broken and announced that the strait was closing once more. Washington disputed it. The United States said ships were still passing, even as both sides left for fresh talks in Switzerland. And that is the uneasy truth of this place. The single most important waterway on Earth, and the two sides can no longer agree whether it is open or shut. Because when this water is threatened, the shock does not stay at sea. It reaches a family in Delhi paying more for cooking gas, a trucker in Europe watching the diesel gauge climb, a farmer who can no longer afford fertilizer, and the shopper who pays for it months later, a factory that falls quiet, a central bank that thought it had finally beaten inflation, starting over. Most will never see the strait or even learn its name. And a few, like 3 men who only went to work on a tanker, pay with far more than money. We built a world that assumes the oil will always flow. Twice in 2026, it did not. The Strait of Hormuz can close in an afternoon, and the whole world feels it long before it ever understands why.